Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Terumot. We're up to Perek Yud Aleph Mishnah Hey. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat, Neria ben Tzvetlana, Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Minuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. Today's Mishnah is going to discuss seeds of Terumah fruit. The Mishnah says, Gar'ine Terumah, seeds of Terumah fruit, Bizman Shu Mechanisan, when the Kohen collects and saves the seeds as he eats the fruits with the intention of eating them, Asurot, the seeds are forbidden to a non-Kohen, meaning they have to be treated as Terumah. Now, the Mefarshim explain, although fruit seeds are not food and therefore they're not Terumah mideoraita by Torah law, nevertheless, midrabanan, rabbinically the sages decreed that if the Kohen saves them, treating them as food and not as waste, they must be treated as terumah. And the Mefarshim explain that the rabbis were concerned that people would confuse these seeds with the actual terumah and think just like seeds are exempt from terumah, so too the fruit is. Therefore, the Chachamim, the sages decreed, the seeds have to be treated as terumah. But the Mefarshim do point out the Mishnah is referring to seeds that are somewhat soft and edible, like the seeds of apples, pears, or the seeds like date pits, which are sucked for their moisture. That's when the seeds are going to be treated as terumah if the Kohen considers them to be food, because that's likely they're going to be confused with the fruit. However, hard seeds which are not edible, they do not have to be treated as terumah, even if a particular Kohen saves them, because no one will confuse them with food. The Mishnah says, but if the Kohen throws away the seeds, mutarot, they are permitted to a non-Kohen, because since the seeds are being discarded as waste, they don't need to be treated as terumah, because in this case also, no one will confuse the seeds with actual fruit. The Mishnah now discusses another unrelated case where the status of an item depends on whether you keep it or throw it away. The Mishnah says, V'chen atzmot hakodashim, a similar halacha applies to the bones of offerings, bizman shu mechanesan asurin. When the person eating the offering collects and saves the bones with the intention of eating them, they are prohibited, meaning the bones are subject to the same restrictions as the meat of the korban of the offering. And let us explain. The Mefarshim say, for example, the meat of an offering must be eaten within a certain time period, 1 or 2 days, depending on what korban it is. If meat is left over after that time, it becomes what the Torah calls notar, leftover, and it must be burned. So now, whether this halakha applies to the bones depends on how you treat the bones. If the person eating the korban, the offering, treats the bones as food, they must be eaten before the proper time, and they have to be burned if they're left over. However, if he discarded the bones, he threw them out, they do not become notar, and they don't have to be burned because they're not considered part of the korban. And the Mefarshim explain, the Mishnah here too is referring to bones that are somewhat edible, like soft bones, cartilage, and the like. Since these are eaten by some people, but thrown out by others, their status depends on how the person eating the korban, the offering, treats them. But bones that are not edible, they do not have the status of meat, even if a particular person treats them as food. The Mishnah continues now to discuss whether bran, which is the shell of a wheat kernel, has terumah sanctity. The Mishnah says, Hamulsan mutar. Coarse bran of terumah grain is permitted to a non-Kohen, meaning it does not have the status of terumah, because people do not eat it. And the Mefarshim explain, bran is the husk that surrounds a grain kernel. Before the kernels are in the ground, they are beaten, and larger pieces of the husk fall off. These pieces are the coarse bran. The kernel is then ground into flour, and the remaining smaller pieces of bran, which are fine bran, are sifted out of the flour, and generally none of the bran is eaten. We're just saying the coarse bran is the large pieces that fall off, and the fine bran are the smaller pieces when the kernel is ground into flour. So the Mishnah says, Hamusan mutar, coarse bran of terumah grain is permitted to an non-Kohen. It's not subject to laws of terumah because people do not eat it. Subin shel chadashot asurot. However, fine bran that comes from fresh grain of terumah is prohibited to non-Kohanim, because although the bran itself doesn't have terumah sanctity, because nobody eats bran, it tends to have regular flour, which is terumah, mixed into it. Because the Mefarshim explain, fresh grain, the Mishnah specifically said chadashot, fresh grain, right? The Mefarshim say fresh grain is within 30 days of its harvest. So such grain is moist, and after it is ground, some of the flour sticks to the bran. So although the bran itself is inedible and is not terumah, it is forbidden because of the flour that is attached to it. This, the Mefarshim say, is not a concern by the coarse bran, because the coarse bran is removed before the grain is ground into flour. Therefore, a non-Kohen must avoid the fine bran, v'shel ishanot mutarot, but fine bran that comes from old grain of terumah is permitted, because this bran does not usually contain any flour. The Rav says old grain is dry, so after it is ground, the bran can easily be sifted from the flour, and it doesn't stick together. V'noeg bitruma kederech shu noeg bechulin, and a kohen may treat terumah grain the same way he treats chulin grain, meaning he may sift out the bran from the terumah grain and throw it out, because like we said, this bran is not terumah and therefore it can be destroyed. However, the Mefarshim say he cannot discard the fine bran from the flour of fresh wheat, because that has terumah likely mixed into it. Hamsalet kav o kabaim lis'a. The Mishnah now is going to give us a halacha about sifting flour after the bran was already thrown out. Hamsalet kav o kabaim lis'a. If a kohen takes terumah flour from which the bran has been removed, and he sifts it again until he is left with 1 or 2 kav of fine flour from a se'ah of ordinary flour, lo ya'abed dashar, he may not destroy the leftovers, meaning he cannot destroy the lesser quality flour that he sifted out. Rather, he must put it in a protected place. And the Mefarshim explain, although this kohen wants the finer flour, the lesser quality flour is nevertheless fit to be eaten and therefore has terumah sanctity, and accordingly he may not destroy it. The Mefarshim say we're talking about a kohen after the bran has been removed, right? We know that the flour is still somewhat coarse. So this kohen wants finer flour, and he takes a se'ah, which is a measure of 6 kav of regular flour, and he sifts it again and again until he's left with only 1 or 2 kav of very fine flour. So the Mishnah says, lo yebet dashar, he cannot destroy the leftovers. Rather, put it b'makom hamutzna. He should keep it in a place where no non-kohen will eat it and where it will not become tameh, and leave it like that. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Hey. Mishnah Vav now discusses how a person should clean out a storeroom of terumah, so that he can store chulin inside of it. If there is a storeroom from which a person cleared out terumah wheat, but a few scattered kernels remain, we do not require him to sit and pick up the few remaining terumah kernels one by one before putting chulin wheat in the storeroom. Rather, he may clean out the storeroom as he usually does, which the Mefarshim say, like you would clean a room that was filled with chulin grain, in which case you would probably overlook a few scattered kernels. The same way, you're not required to be any more thorough when cleaning a storeroom of terumah. And then he may put chulin wheat into the storeroom. And the Mefarshim say, we are not concerned about the fact that the remaining terumah kernels will become mixed with the chulin wheat that will be stored there, because those few kernels of terumah will be nullified by the chulin wheat, and the whole roomful will be considered chulin. And the Mefarshim explain, like we learned in chapter 4, Mishnah 7, the concept of bitul nullification is that when two species are mixed, the majority substance cancels out the minority one. So here, the larger amount of chulin cancels out the few kernels of terumah, and therefore the entire roomful is considered chulin. Now, although we learned that terumah cannot be nullified by chulin unless the chulin is 100 times the amount of the terumah, in this case the rabbis made an exception, and the terumah is nullified as long as there is twice as much chulin. Now, as a rule, we know, we spoke about this in chapter 5, Mishnah 9, a person may not intentionally mix a forbidden substance with a larger one, a larger permitted one, in order for the forbidden substance to become nullified. What we call en mevadlin isur lechatchila. You cannot take, 100 ounces of meat soup and put in a drop of milk, because even though it's going to be canceled, that milk flavor, en mevadlin isur lechatchila. We're not allowed to intentionally mix a forbidden substance with a larger permitted one in order for it to become nullified. Therefore, a person may not intentionally mix chulin with terumah in order to cause a terumah to become nullified. Here, however, the person is mutar to deliberately fill his storeroom with chulin, even though now he's going to be canceling out the remaining terumah, because here he's not filling the room with the intention to cancel out the terumah. He just wants to store his chulin wheat, and he leaves the terumah in the storeroom simply because there is so little terumah that he does not care to remove it. And that is the end, Rabotai, of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.